Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the untamed frontier of central Idaho. The headwaters of the Middle Fork of the Salmon River is sparsely populated by people even now. The steep, decomposed granite mountains are covered with pine and fir trees and low-growing berry bushes like blueberry, huckleberry, elderberry, and raspberry. These berry bushes provide seasonal nutrients, sugars, and minerals to animals ranging from chipmunks to grizzly bears. Mountain bluebirds stand out as they flit through the green scrub bush that screen the privacy of the deer and the elk that roam the valleys. This area is extremely rugged and very isolated, but in June of 1886, it was the kind of country that beckoned to tough frontier people. Old Ike was one of the most successful bear hunters in the Rocky Mountains and called central Idaho his home. With ranches and farms springing up across the newly formed state, the demand for a bear hunter was at an all-time high. Many of the ranchers and farmers in Idaho had to raise their food and hope for enough to sell to others. Bears didn't bother following the customs of human society and would simply kill and eat whatever livestock they would need to survive. That's when Old Ike came into the picture. He would study the bear and its patterns and carefully set up a confrontation he knew he would win. He would get a nice grizzly rug or hide and some meat and some very useful bear tallow out of the deal, and they would also pay him for his services. There were safer jobs a man could do, but most of these jobs are taken by men who aren't brave enough to be a bear bounty hunter. Old Ike was a hunting legend as he single-handedly killed around 100 grizzly bears, bringing safety to livestock herds and prosperity to ranches and farms throughout Idaho. He's been contacted about a huge grizzly up on the untamed Salmon River headwaters that is terrorizing local ranches. Old Ike and a few young partners head toward the area and in a few days are speaking with the ranch owners about the problem bears in the area. Most ranchers feel like they can handle the black bears of the area, but this giant grizzly bear that calls the area around Dagger Falls his home is far too fierce for them to handle. Old Ike agrees with his partners to head out and find the giant grizz and bring a little frontier justice to him. As Old Ike and his group arrive in the area, they survey the lay of the land. Being familiar with grizzly bears, Old Ike knows that the bears will use certain resources at certain times and other resources at other times. And this early in the summer, the bears will be hunting deer fawns and elk calves along the mountain meadows. Predators including wolves, cougars, and bears use the transition and cover between forests and meadows to sneak upon their prey. Ike knows this and begins searching meadow edges for bear tracks and scat. The hunters are about 2 weeks into their stalk when they come across some huge and very promising tracks along a small creek. They are definitely grizzly bear tracks, and big enough to be the tracks of the dominant bear in the area. Old Ike is certain it is the bear he's looking for. The hunters set up a few baits and traps to see if they can lure the big bear into the open, and it isn't long before they are seeing some interesting progress. They find the bear's tracks leaving a marsh and follow him for several miles. At the far end of the meadow, they see the big bear striding across the edge of the trees. The men hustle to a point at which they can intercept the bear, and their hard work pays off with a good shot. Old Ike follows his instincts and is rewarded with a good solid hit on the giant bruin. When shooting a large bear, the hunter will ideally strike a bone of some sort. The most damaging shots will break the bones of the shoulder, legs, or hips. This will keep the bear from going too far too fast and will hopefully keep it from killing you. Old Ike's shot passed through the ribs and created a nice blood trail, but definitely didn't break anything structural, like a bone. The men trailed the bear until its blood trail led into a patch of very thick, small trees. This type of tree patch is called a jack pine patch, and consists of shorter pine trees typically under about 8 feet in height. The branches grow wide and low and create an environment that is easy to move through, but very difficult to see even medium distances in. Old Ike knows how bears and other animals use jack pine stands to conceal themselves or their escape routes, so he slowly follows each drop of blood into the stand, moving from drop to drop and splatter to splatter. The old man is not what he used to be in his youth, as his vision and hearing are losing their sharpness. He can see the larger blood spatters easily, but misses some of the smaller drops. His hearing still picks up the lower loud tones, like a growl, but doesn't quite get the higher pitched sounds anymore, like small twigs snapping just a few yards to his right. Unbeknownst to Old Ike, the wily grizzly bear has set up a trap to catch his hunter. Being a predator himself, the bear knows if he walks in a straight line and circles back to within just a few yards of his old trail, his hunter will walk right in front of him without knowing how close the bear is. And that is exactly what the giant bear does. As Old Ike follows the blood sign and tracks further into the jack pine stand, he incrementally follows a path that leads him right in front of the concealed bear. Just as Old Ike walks past the bear, the giant Bruin leaps from its hiding spot and shoves the hunter to the ground. This bear is so large that the frail and gaunt old man is no match for him and thumps on the ground. The enraged and wounded grizzly next opens up its enormous mouth and bites into Old Ike's chest. The enraged and wounded grizzly next opens its enormous mouth and bites into Old Ike's chest. As the bear closes its jaws, his canine teeth puncture the skin and penetrate Old Ike's ribcage. Then the bear crushes the old man's chest with a single bite. Old Ike's hunting partners can hear the yelling and growling coming from the jack pine patch and rush in to see what's going on. As they approach, they can see the bear standing over Old Ike and run the bear off so they can help their friend. Shooting at the bear as it stood over Ike could have wounded or killed their friend, and the bear fled the attack scene quickly anyway. Old Ike is in bad shape, and he's struggling to breathe. His face is wrinkled in pain, and his color is fading as he's losing the battle for his life. In only a few minutes, his breath shortens, and he dies from the injuries imparted by the grizzly bear. Old Ike's legacy as a bear bounty hunter is cemented into Idaho history. With his passing, and many farmers and ranchers say he brought stability and safety to the frontier. But today, there are some who say he decimated a species he may have misunderstood. What do you think? Do you think Old Ike performed a necessary service to the area farms and ranches? Or do you think he did more damage than he helped? Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains in central California. The Sierra Nevadas are one of the highest and most prestigious mountain ranges in the world and serve as the spine of California, running from the Mexican border all the way to around the Oregon border. The giant granite peaks seem to touch the sky and host hundreds of miles of largely uninterrupted fir and pine forests. At the time of our incident, there were no highways crossing the mountain passes, and assistance was often too far away to actually help. John Adams was born in 1812 in Medway, Massachusetts, and made his way to California when he was 37 years old, after his shoe business failed due to fire. He left his family and made his way to the wilds of California to become a trapper, miner, and hunter. Having nearly died from 2 illnesses during his trek, he arrived in California in mid-December. He utilized his knowledge gained as an animal trainer and hunter in New England to make his own buckskins, moccasins, harness, saddles, and snowshoes, and with help from the Miwok Indians built a cabin and stable to winter over. In 1853, he navigated around 1,200 miles on one of his hunting and trapping expeditions, clear up to the eastern portion of the Washington Territory. While out on an excursion, he discovered a female yearling cub and quickly caught her. He moonlighted as an animal trainer and would sometimes catch animals and sell them to circuses or other menageries. He named the young grizzly Lady Washington. Incredibly, he eventually tamed Lady Washington and she became his constant sidekick. He even rode on her back, and she cuddled him in freezing conditions to keep him warm. Later on, Lady Washington would have a tryst in the Rocky Mountains and eventually have a cub Adams would name General Fremont. A year later, Grizzly, as he came to be known, pulled 2 two-week-old cubs from a grizzly sow's den while she hibernated in the Yosemite Valley. He raised the cubs himself, and one of them stuck around long enough to be named Ben, after Benjamin Franklin. Adams and Ben were quickly inseparable, and Ben would follow Adams anywhere he went. The odd couple were once traveling through the Sierra Nevadas and came across a sow with 3 cubs. This sow was first of all offended that there was a man nearby, and compounding her offense, a boar bear to boot. The sow rushed Adams and quickly swatted his rifle out of his hands with her left paw before he had a chance to fire. Then with her right paw, knocked him flailing, landing face down. She then dug her huge canines into the flesh of his back and tore flesh, buckskin, and flannel shirt from his body. Just in the nick of time, the yearling Ben joined the fight and chomped onto her haunches. She spun around and dug her teeth into Ben's skull, blinding him in one of his eyes. Then she used her paws to crush him into the ground while she brutally bit into his shoulder to lift him off the ground and shake him violently back and forth. The wounded Adams had the luxury of watching the 2 bears square off, but the heartbreak of watching his best friend Ben be wounded and beaten. By then, the man had gathered himself enough to lift his rifle and drive a bullet home through the sow's heart, stopping the brutality for once and for all. Ben healed eventually, and the two continued on with their life in the woods. The record does not indicate what became of her 3 cubs, but I assume Adams merged them into his menagerie. A few months later, Adams and Ben were ambushed again, and this time the bear got to Adams before Ben could stop the violence. The bear surprised Adams as he rounded a bend in the trail and quickly slapped him upside his head, knocking him down and gashing his scalp. Then the bear began tearing his scalp from his head while punching a hole in his skull the size of a silver dollar. The attack was over as quickly as it had started, as the large bear departed, leaving Adams temporarily incapacitated and Ben completely confused. Adams and Ben made their way back to camp, and slowly the man regained his health and energy. The hole in his skull never healed fully and would routinely be opened up in the coming years. After healing a while, Adams constructed a huge cage and his mind set on capturing a large grizzly. He hauled the trap into his hunting territory and set it up with bait and began watching. Once the trap was set, he had caught the largest grizzly bear ever caught in a live trap. This giant weighed 1,500 pounds when he was weighed on a hay scale, and John would call him Samson. Eventually, John would utilize his hunting and trapping skills to amass a small zoo's worth of animals. He started to show the public his animal collection and opened up a museum in San Francisco. It was during one of these shows in January of 1859 that Adams was wrestling with General Fremont when the bear struck him in the head, reopening the hole in his skull from the prior grizzly attack. Though it had been about 5 years since that attack, his scalp had partially healed but was displaced, and the hole in his skull remained open. After being struck this last time, Adams' brain tissue was exposed and his health began deteriorating. A few months later, in the summer of 1860, Adams was working with one of the monkeys in his menagerie when the monkey jumped onto his head and bit his unhealed wound where his brain was exposed. Experts believe the monkey bite may have led to meningitis, which is an infection of one of the layers of tissue surrounding the brain beneath the skull. After spending more than 10 years away from his wife and daughter, Adams retired back to Massachusetts but died a mere 5 days after the reunion. John Grizzly Adams left a legacy that would have him described as the greatest California mountain man of all time. He captured more grizzly bears than most mountain men of the time had killed. He was inducted into the Western Hall of Fame in 1911 and received the Heroes of California honor. Although not a trained scientist, Adams left behind the largest collection of mounted and live animal specimens in his museum, which eventually became the Pacific Museum in San Francisco. His menagerie spawned the Bronx Zoo and Zoological Gardens in Central Park, both of New York, as well as Woodward's Gardens and Fleshacre Zoo in the Bay Area. Adams' bear Samson actually served as the model for the California State Bear emblem. In addition, Adams narrated his memoirs to an author named Hittel, who compiled the book The Adventures of James Capen Adams. Later, his life story would be turned into a television series in the 1970s called The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams. I would love to hear your thoughts on this amazing story of Grizzly Adams and his bear friends, as well as his bear attack that eventually led to his death. I have to ask, did he prove that bears and humans can closely coexist safely? Were the actions of Adams harmful to bears? Please remember to like and subscribe, as well as to tap on that bell icon so you're notified on our next amazing bear attack story here on Scary Bear Attacks. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. This episode is Wolf Dogs Save Frank Glazer from a Giant Bear. This video features a tale that takes place in the remote Alaska mountains near Valdez. Frank Glazer was a woodsman who ran the Black Rapids Roadhouse on the old Valdez Trail and augmented his income by hunting for sheep, caribou, and moose that he sold to the Alaska Road Commission to feed their workers. These were the road crews that were building the Richardson Highway. From August day in 1921, when Frank first observed the giant bear. It was very dark and had been wandering around across the river from his roadhouse. He tried several times to get near the bear for a kill shot, but was prevented by the rushing glacial waters of the river. For safety's sake, he would turn back each time. Around a week or so later, Frank heard his sled dogs barking and thought there may be a caribou or a bear nearby. So he grabbed his .30-06 hunting rifle and went outside to investigate. All this ruckus wasn't caused by a bear, but by two very large wolf dogs. He tried to chase them off by throwing rocks at them, but they would dodge but remain. He decided they must not be wild or they would have left, so he tried calling them to him. They wagged their tails and came right up to him. He adopted them on the spot. Frank tried to do the right thing and tell everyone he met, but the dog's owner never came by to claim them, so he added them to his dog sled team. He dubbed the large one Yukon and the other Red. Yukon lined up immediately as the lead dog, and Frank decided to give him a try. Strong and fast, he was a great lead dog on the team. A few months passed, and Frank and the dog team were out running down his trap lines and harvesting fur to sell. Frank noticed that a patch of willows had an abnormal amount of frost on them, and upon further investigation found out that a bear had denned up for the winter there, and the breath from the bruin had caused the frost on the willows. Frank took a mental note to check it out in the spring to see if it was the den of the big bear he had been watching in the summer. By early May, the snow was in full retreat from the Alaska range, and Frank decided to go look at the den once again, and brought Red and Yukon along. From a good distance, Frank could see the bear's tracks leaving the den. They were enormous. It must have been the big, dark bear he previously had observed. Frank paused and read the bear sign on the ground. It looked like the big bear headed up the canyon only a few hours ago. This meant the bear had no way out. Frank had the big fella cornered. Frank followed the largest bear tracks he'd ever seen, with its giant claws showing clearly in each track. Yukon and Red pushed the trail ahead of Frank, which concerned him. This bear could easily kill his dogs. As the trio continued up the canyon, it grew narrower, and the giant bear tracks continued in a single direction. The only way out was past Frank and his dogs. Frank could see evidence that the bear was trying to get out of the canyon and would climb as high as he could, only to slide back down. At last the hunter and his companions arrived at what Frank knew was the last turn in the canyon. The giant would have to be nearby. They rounded the bend, but no bear. There was no cover in the canyon, and there was no way out. It was far too steep to climb out, even for a bear. Frank looked down and observed the bear's tracks crisscrossing and meandering all over, looking for a way out. Frank looked up at one set of the giant tracks, and they led straight up a chute in the canyon. Damn, Frank thought, as he realized the bruin had found a way out. Slightly more than 30 feet above Frank, the clatter of rocks and ice falling down the chute, pushed downhill by the gargantuan bear, sliding back toward the bottom on his rear end. Red and Yukon streaked past Frank to confront the bear, with Frank yelling to them to stop. The bear offered a perfect shot to his vitals, but the dogs were running and barking and carrying on. Frank couldn't get a safe shot without being sure to miss the dogs. The report of the rifle echoed thunderously through the box canyon, and the slug found its mark in the bear's shoulder. The bear roared in pain and rage as the dogs continued to attack and frustrate him. Regaining his feet, the massive mauler scanned the area, trying to assess what had just happened to him. The three beasts had no more left the canyon much later than they had re-entered it. This time, the bear pursuing the dogs. They were all headed straight toward Frank. Sliding to a stop, Frank's feet slipped out from under him, and straight onto his back he went. He knew the group would be upon him in an instant, but saw the dogs race past him, with the bear hobbling in angry pursuit. The dogs cornered the bear in a flat area of one of the chutes. Red would go around behind the giant, while Yukon would dance around in front to antagonize him. All of this commotion distracted Frank, too, as he bounced the sights of his rifle around, dodging his dogs. Frank scooted to one side of the canyon, anticipating the bear to beat another retreat in the only direction he could. Sure enough, the bear ran by, gnashing his teeth in anger and confusion. Frank could see the individual hairs on the bear's hide. He was so close. The bear and the dogs would trade off in a strange game of who is chasing who, and Frank would fire 2 more deafening shots. The bear was slowing now, as Frank's bullets had found their mark and taken their toll. The bear was bleeding from the bullet wounds as well as the dog bites from several places. The massive bear took a last stand position to face the dogs, and that gave Frank an opening to place a shot to the bear's ribs, and the bear collapsed. Lifting his head a few times in defiance, the bear was finally put to rest with a coup de grace shot behind his ear. Frank paused to marvel at how well the dogs distracted the bear the entire time. Frank skinned the giant bear and measured its hide. It squared at 10 feet 8 inches, which means that the bear was nearly 11 feet from nose to tip of his tail. A true giant. Around June, a Model T pulled up and a blond-headed man approached from it. He saw Yukon and Red and immediately rushed to embrace them. Frank asked if the man knew those dogs, and the visitor affirmed that he did. Elmer lived a ways away on Slate Creek and was mining that area. The dogs were his and protected his family. He proudly announced they were Victoria Land Dogs, a special local wolf-dog hybrid used for pulling sleds. Frank begrudgingly returned Yukon and Red to their rightful owner. A few years later, Frank acquired his own set of Victoria Land Dogs for his sled team and refused to sell that giant bear pelt for any amount.